Welcome to another CEO Wisdom podcast with Nick Grono today. He is CEO at the Freedom Fund. We are going to discuss nonprofits, modern slavery, human trafficking, and everything in between. Nick has an interesting background, and fortunately for us, he dedicated his life nowadays to helping that cause. Modern slavery is still a thing. Human trafficking is still a thing. I learned, sadly enough, and we're going to discuss about some potential solution to the problem today. So Nick, welcome to the pod. Can you tell us a bit more about yourself and a bit more about the Freedom Fund?
Sure, Charles, great to be here. Thanks for having me on the show. So I'm the CEO of the Freedom Fund. I took up this role almost 10 years ago when we started the Freedom Fund. Freedom Fund's a non-profit to working around the world to end modern slavery, human trafficking, sex trafficking, forced labor, all these horrendous abuses. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a second. In terms of getting here, I actually started off life as a corporate lawyer. And then I worked for Goldman Sachs for a bit in London, and I worked as chief of staff to the Attorney General. But what really motivated me was to work for organizations and lead organizations that were driving positive change around the world. So I started working for nonprofits about 20 years ago, an organization called International Crisis Group that was working on conflict all around the world in places like Syria and the Middle East more broadly, and Afghanistan, and from there I came to head up the Freedom Fund. So that's where we got to. The Freedom Fund was set up, as I said, 10 years ago. I was the first employee. We're now 82 staff around the world in 12 countries working on this crime of slavery. And often people, you hear people talk about slavery and they go, well, what do you mean by slavery? It's like, wasn't slavery abolished a couple of hundred years ago? But the reality is that, the violence that underlies slavery has existed from time immemorial. And while people might not be forcibly locked up in chains these days in the way they were hundreds of years ago, although people are still locked up in chains as well, let's be clear, but they're trapped and forced and threatened with violence and forced to work with little or no pay, often sexually abused, often to produce goods, much more cheaply than they would otherwise be produced. And there's some 50 million people in slavery today. And that may well be an underestimate, because it's a hidden crime. So a horrible crime exists all around the world in many different forms, and that's what the Freedom Fund is trying to combat.
Your transition from lawyer and Wall Street, quote unquote, it is due to what? What happened in your heart for you to understand that there were more than money?
I think the main thing that happened was when I was a corporate lawyer in Australia at one of the biggest law firms in Australia, they gave me the chance to go work for free, pro bono. They paid my salary, but at Legal Aid. And Legal Aid worked for the people who couldn't afford lawyers, who are often accused of crimes, the most vulnerable in our society. And I worked there for 6 months, and it just opened my eyes up to a world that I should have known a lot more about. And it was about how if you can't access the law, how vulnerable you can be. And how people with money can access the law and get the law to act on their behalf, but people who are poor often have their rights trampled upon. And so it's a long and winding path from there, but I think that's where the seed was planted some 30 odd years ago. And then progressively, I've moved away from the corporate world into the nonprofit world step by step, from corporate to government. From government, I went and did a master's in the US in public policy, and from there into the nonprofit world. So that's been the pathway.
The Freedom Fund was started by some very powerful folks, notably Bill Clinton. You raised $200 million, but slavery is still a thing. Tell us as per why it is so pernicious and such a tough stain to remove on the surface of this planet Earth.
Yeah, so slavery happened. The people who get trapped in slavery and human trafficking are, as I said, the most vulnerable. Right? It doesn't happen to people like you and me. Despite we watch movies like Taken and so on, it really doesn't happen to people like that. What it happens to is people who are hugely vulnerable in society and often seeking a better life, and they get tricked and coerced and then forced into a world. So, it happens with migrants coming across from South America into the US, and they arrive in the US illegally. They may owe a huge debt, and so they can't work anywhere legally. So they take work that is illegal, but then they're often threatened by the people who are employing them, saying, well, if you don't, I mean, often male bosses might say, if you don't sleep with me, then I will turn you over to the authorities. And not only that, but I'm not going to pay you what I promised you. And what can you do about it? And if you threaten to leave, well, in fact, you owe me $10,000, so I'm going to have people chase after you. So it's this kind of constant threat and violence. So that's one form. In places we work, in places like Burma and Myanmar, the country is being torn apart by civil war. And so women are migrating or being tricked into migrating into China, where there's a shortage of women, marriageable women. And so women are offered jobs, and then it turns out, in fact, they're not being offered jobs. They're being forced to marry someone and have children. And their traffickers say they owe them money, and they're trafficked into the country. They don't know where they are. If they try and leave, they're physically abused and raped and forced to have children, right? It's kind of forced marriage at its most extreme. If you look at the Congo, we have a desperate need around the world for certain minerals like coltan, which powers our batteries for our electric cars and phones. Well, coltan is mined in some of the most dangerous parts of the world, including the Congo, which has been torn apart by civil war for decades. And so young boys are tricked and forced. Sometimes they take the jobs voluntarily, but then they don't get paid what they're offered, and then they're threatened and forced to work. And they work in these horrendous conditions and die at an awful rate. And that's modern slavery, right? And that touches us all, because we all use mobile phones, and some of us have electric cars, or we use solar panels that might be produced in China from forced labor, or cotton goods that might be produced from forced labor in places like India. So we're all touched by this, which is why we think everyone should be kind of committed to addressing this horrendous abuse.
Right. Couple of consultations. So first, it's always the weakest. Who are the weakest? Women and children, generally speaking. Second, there's two main motives to it. So cash and sex, both which are very much men's two hobbies. Let's call it that way. So it's probably about protecting the weakest folks in these societies. To me, it's like, oh, could the authority investigate these cases and really uncover them? And just like there's corporate fraud programs in which you can flag someone, you can whistle blow. I don't like that term, but you can just say, hey, this guy's not doing his things right. I think that could be a potential solution. And the second one, even without whistleblowers, there could be investigators, just like there's ESG nowadays in publicly listed companies. It's taking the market by trend right now. Maybe there could be this, but people would show up in businesses or in plants, in manufacturing plants, and really check that everything is okay right now. And yeah, what are the potential solutions to that? Because money is a very strong driver. It's massive energy. Where are you investing that money nowadays?
Yeah, no, really good. And you're absolutely right. It's the weakest, right? So it can be women and girls. It can be religious minorities in countries, or it can be if you're a particular caste in countries that have castes, or it can be if you're a refugee. And the common factor is that these people aren't often protected by the law. So the authorities turn a blind eye, right? I mean, slavery in all its forms is illegal everywhere. So it happens despite the laws being in place. And it's because people have power and some other people don't have power. I often, I think it's always interesting to look at history, right? And so you can look at our countries, be it the UK or the US, and look at them 300 years ago and how children were often forced to work in horrendous conditions and extremely dangerous conditions. And of course, it changed because regulation and laws changed, and they were enforced because society as a whole said this is unacceptable. Right? It's not about inappropriate regulation. It's about saying there are basic minimum standards, and those standards need to be enforced. And I think we all would agree that slavery, there should be a basic minimum standard that says our goods shouldn't be produced by slave labor, right? Even if it means they're cheaper, or if it means that those producing them make higher profits. So that's where it usually goes. I mean, it's the margins that they take home. So there is a push around the world for stronger regulation looking at supply chains. At the moment, generally what happens is companies say, look, we've got these policies that say no forced labor. So, but then if you say to them, well, how do you check? They say, well, we don't really check because, we don't check our supplier and we don't check their supplier and they don't check their supplier. And so they can effectively close a blind eye to it. So what you need is an obligation on them to check 2 or 3 levels down, and it can be done. There's a really good example with bribery legislation, right? 40 years ago, 50 years ago, companies used to be able to claim the cost of bribery on their balance sheet, on their accounts. And laws were introduced globally. The US has some of the strongest laws against bribery, which said, look, if bribery happens, then the CEO or the C-suite can be held accountable, and criminal legislation. Well, suddenly there was a lot more interest in preventing bribery in these companies at scale. And it means a much more level playing field for everyone. And we need something like that with slavery, right? We need proper accountability. People can look. It probably means paying more for some things, but so does eliminating child labor in the US means you pay more, right? Stopping companies from pumping dangerous chemicals into our waterways means they probably have higher expenses, but we're willing to accept the cost, right? Spread across the whole economy. There are certain things that are fairly fundamental, and I think tackling slavery is one of them.
Right. Multinationals, yeah, you can keep them accountable. They've got investors. They are legally registered in a country, so you could ask them to dig deep and make sure that their whole supply chain is clean. Now, third world country is another story. Most of these countries don't even have solid laws and enforce them. More or less, kind of corruption is prevalent, and they just enforce them whenever they want, or when the police is being paid. So then the other question or concern that I have is that, I mean, these folks, these vulnerable folks that make the slave ownership deal happen, they kind of sold their soul to the devil, right? So indeed they wanted something. So whether it is like, hey, help me cross the border, help me get in the US, or help me get in Germany or whatever, and in exchange I will do that, and they do very irrational things to get there. They think their life will be completely changed, but they just traded crap to a bigger pile of crap, so I guess my question is, can there be technological platform that would give them what they want with a clear contract, and maybe not selling their soul to the devil, but yeah, like, do this for me, I will do that for you. Obviously it's not sexual favors or massive cash with massive interest rates. That is one. And two, because yeah, I'm a technologist, so I always think of technology to fix these problems. And two, what role does education have to play with that, and how can we reach or educate someone that's about to cross the border that has a not so good life and probably not even access to technology to educate themselves?
Yeah, well, you've asked about 4 big questions there. So on the corruption piece, look, everywhere is corrupt, right? I mean, we hear stories of corruption in our countries all the time. Some are more corrupt than others, but I think with supply chains, if a US multinational or a European multinational is sourcing from corrupt countries with weak rule of law, we can still say that they have to ensure that there are appropriate standards all the way through, right? And you have the ability to look in your supply chains if you care enough. So I think we do need to raise the standards in the countries where we can enforce the rule of law. Dealing with the devil is a really hard one, right? I always try and picture myself in these situations, and if you were in Mexico now and there's a massive earthquake and you needed to get out of the country and you need to pay $20,000, $50,000 up front, you would take a deal with the devil to get you and your family safely. And you shouldn't be held accountable just because you are trying to achieve a better life. Refugees, I get that they're often making really difficult decisions, but a lot of these cases aren't like that. They're people in the country whose kids are offered jobs in the city and schooling by some distant relative, and it turns out, in fact, that they're being trafficked into, workshops or set. So they're not doing a deal with the devil. They're just trying to take the chances that all of us try and take to improve our lives. And I find that so desperately sad, right? And so that's about then trying to make sure the rule of law is enforced, and it's the really boring work. But ultimately, the way you change all of this is you have to shift power, right? If people are vulnerable because of their circumstances, but if they can come together as community groups and organizations, they can acquire a lot more power. They can't be picked off one by one and trafficked. And basically, that's the way the Freedom Fund approaches all of this. They can provide, so we work with frontline local groups, grassroots groups. They can provide the education you were talking about, right? So one example is you take the World Cup. Tens of thousands, in fact, hundreds of thousands of workers from Nepal, Bangladesh, Southeast Asia, Africa, came to work in Qatar to build World Cup stadiums, promised lots of money, and often treated horrendously, and they're not paid. So they're not taking risks. They had legal contracts, just that some of the construction companies and the other companies aren't meeting their end of the bargain. So what we need to be able to do is, one, for them to be able to organize to enforce their rights, to push the government, to lobby the government, right, to kind of educate people before they come to places like Qatar or elsewhere, what their rights are, what they need to check for, who are the reputable employers or recruiters. And one of the most effective ways of doing that is working with the grassroots groups that understand the problem. Technology is a tool, not a solution, and it's a really important tool, right? It's an absolutely important way of getting information about conditions and sharing that information. But if people are willing to use violence to, not to meet their obligations, technology won't solve it on its own. So I think we can do a lot more thinking about how can technology better inform people, ensure that we get access to what's going on, right? The world is being transformed. We have a much deeper understanding of what's happening in these scenarios because of social media, because people with smartphones can take videos. We know so much more about the abuses. We can track factories in China that may be using forced labor because we can take satellite imagery and start analyzing it. And, we can do the same in places like Burma and elsewhere. So absolutely, tech is part of the solution. And I think nonprofits often don't think smartly enough about using tech, but it's really important to think of it as a tool that helps you get to the point you want to be.
Right, because everything is energy, right? Like the slave owner, he wants to generate more energy with more cash and more sex. Apparently, that would give him more energy. The other person, on the end, their current life is low energy, and they think that emigrating someplace else will give them more energy in this new life, give them more resources. That being said, my question is, using that tech, could we possibly educate that person on, hey, because, well, if we talk from the root cause, my understanding is that immigration is one of the main use cases for slave ownership. It's where like most of the abuse. We may talk about other use cases after that question, but could we just give that person a plethora of options? Okay, if you immigrate there, these are the standards of life. This is what you need to avoid. This is how much you'll get paid. You'll get your green card after 2 years or whatever. That is one. And two, still talking about that app. Well, first we would have to make that app known to that person, maybe through ads or something. Everyone uses Facebook or WhatsApp, for example. But could that app also have like a flagging platform, like, hey, I'm in this dangerous situation, and then you and Freedom Fund on the other end, there would be this kind of chat center, if you want, and you could tell that person, okay, this is what you need to do. We're gonna chat daily, like don't get caught doing this by your tormentor, and this will take like 7 to 10 days. This is or point of contact. She's a nice lady. You can meet her there, and like, would that be possible, or this is like CIA far-fetched stuff?
No, it's not possible, but let's talk it through. So, you talk energy, I talk power. Someone has lots of power, someone doesn't have power, and how do they access power? But say you're a Nepali guy who wants to go work in Qatar because, there are good jobs there, and there are. And if you get paid enough, you can support family and a lot more than you're doing in Nepal. So you go to a recruiter who says, right, and you have all the information about what your legal rights are in Qatar, and there are lots of legal rights. And you go to a recruiter who says, right, I can get you the job, you have to pay me $3,000, right? So, and the guy thinks about it and says, okay, well, that's not great, but $3,000 if I can earn 1,500 a month. But then you go there and you're put in a labor camp with lots of other Nepali workers. You're not allowed out freely. You don't have access to your mobile phone or whatever. And suddenly they don't pay you 1,500. They pay, and they've got your passport, because they always take away people's passports. And they say, if you complain, we'll turn you over to the Qatari authorities, who really aren't interested in what you're upset about as a Nepali worker. They may export you. They may just throw you straight out of the country, but if they throw you out of the country, you still owe me $3,000, which, by the way, now is $4,000 because 25% interest rate paid every 6 months. And you can alert people, but query whether anyone will. So you're absolutely thinking about, so what we would be saying, okay, well, is how can we connect them with other people who can help them access their rights? Are there groups in Qatar or outside of Qatar that can, there are some great groups that are set up, workers' rights groups, that are trying to get people access to the rights. And if their rights are violated, they take it up with the authorities. So it's not just the one individual. So yes, information is key, bringing people together and finding ways, but it's not as though people do this. People committing the abuses know they're committing the abuses, right? They're not doing it because they're misinformed. They're doing it because they can get away with it and make profits, and the laws don't hold them accountable. So you have to find ways of changing that system or accessing power in a way that changes that dynamic.
I wouldn't call that one easy, but I think it's just a PR disaster for Qatar and UAE. And I wouldn't think it's going to happen again, since they kind of established the fact that they have no respect for these immigrants, right? I'm not sure if I'm right saying that, but my picture is more like vulnerable women and children crossing the border and being taken by, I mean, slave ownership is not this prevalent thing, it's not popular. I guess we're kind of digging down something deep. It's like dark individuals most of the time that do it. Is that what we're facing?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's a really good question, right? I mean, when Qatar was awarded the World Cup about, 12 years ago, we all said this is a real problem because we all know these abuses are going on. And Qatar said, look, we've had some problems, we'll fix them up. And FIFA, the World Cup Football Association said, yeah, they've promised they'll fix them up. And they made some changes, but not really enough. Now Saudi Arabia is keen on hosting the World Cup in 10 years' time. And I'm sure we'll hear the same things. And, Saudi Arabia has a similar system where migrant workers come in and they don't have many rights and they have to give up their passport. So let's see. One might say, look, what happened in Qatar is a lesson, it won't happen again. I get a bit cynical about this and think, some of these countries have a lot of money to splash around and all the rest of it. And sometimes money carries more weight than human rights, sadly.
And in that case, it's pretty obvious to me also that it's not necessarily the country they chose, but it's the organization. FIFA has a track record of corruption, and yeah, it's one of the saddest corporation that exists now to this days. It's like fat guys at the top just smoking cigars, making tons of money, and not digging into stuff. So I think FIFA needs to be held accountable. In that case, I want to talk about like what you're working on precisely now. I saw your book that is coming out. I saw that you have like many plates, kind of, Nick, and you're obviously making an impact. So what are you seeking to accomplish in the next 6 months? So for 2023, in the next couple of years, and how do you measure your impact?
So, well, first and foremost, my focus is always on leading the Freedom Fund. We have so much more to do. And I think we have a model and we can help transform the way people approach slavery and so on. So, making sure the organization is well led and punching above its weight is always my number one focus. I had a 3-month break over summer last year, and I took that to start writing a book. And one thing I'm really passionate about is leadership. That's why I'm on this podcast, right? Because you're interested in leadership. And I thought that we often don't invest in leadership of nonprofits the way we focus on leadership of companies and corporates. And so I wanted to, and leading nonprofits can be quite different in some ways from leading companies, right? Because companies are going to be judged on their financial returns first and foremost, whereas nonprofits are judged on change. That's very, very difficult to measure. And it changes the whole way that the organizations are run and kind of the culture at the organization. So I've just finished that. That will come out in July next year. So it now goes off to the whole editing, proofing page. But it's all part of, I kind of, as I was writing the book, I was thinking, well, actually, I'm learning a lot through writing this book. It makes me a better leader, and therefore I hopefully can lead the Freedom Fund more effectively. So that is it over the next 2 years. It's kind of leading this organization, becoming ever more effective as an organization, getting the book out, hopefully sharing with other leaders and nonprofit leaders in particular how they can improve their impact. Because I think if nonprofits leadership increases, their impact improves, and we see bigger change in the world, which I think is a pretty important ambition.
Yeah, and I see some stats here. 130 frontline partners around the world to liberate approx 30K people from slavery and return 82K at-risk children back to school. So you have like precise KPIs and stats here. How do you identify that a case has really been a slave ownership case, and what are your KPIs? Because I don't have experience in the nonprofits world. I do want to have experience there. Do I measure the impact that I made on the amount of lives change and on the severity of the case?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I wish more nonprofit leaders would think like this, right? Nonprofits can be really sloppy about their impact and what change is, and often we say, hey, we had X meetings and we published X reports and that's our impact. Well, that's not impact, that's not change. I mean, it's the process to getting to impact. Impact is trying to achieve the change you want to achieve. In the slavery space, I often give the example, imagine we work in a place like Northern India, and with our partners, we help liberate 500 people from slavery in a year. Is that positive or negative? And the answer is, well, we don't really know. What if, I mean, it's positive for the 500 people and their families, right? They've come out of slavery, right? They were forced to work in brick kilns, and now they have choice over where they work and earn an income. But what if 1,000 people have gone into slavery in the same space, in that same geography, right? Is that positive change or negative change? Well, if we hadn't been there, there'd probably be 1,500 people in slavery, not 1,000. But actually, it's not a positive change, because what we want to see is a reduction in the overall percentage of people in slavery. So that's what we do, is we measure what percentage of people, if we're going into a region, a city, or defined geography, what percentage of people are in slavery when we start, and 4 years later, what is the percentage change? And that's really the most effective way to see whether or not we've had an impact. And that's what we try and do. It's hard, right? It's much harder than just working out your financial returns. I'm not saying that's easy, but we have to also work out our financial returns. We have to kind of do all of the finances and raise the funding and all the rest of it. But we also have to say, what change have we really contributed to? It would be like holding somebody, I mean, imagine holding FIFA. FIFA says we're promoting peace around the world. Well, I'd like to see measurements on how much more peaceful the world is or isn't, but for FIFA's work, right? But I can tell you what their balance sheet says.
Last question for you, Nick. How do you deal with seeing horrendous stuff almost on a daily basis psychologically? How do you chill away from that or dissipate the stuck-up energy, the trauma of seeing and hearing horrendous things?
Yeah, it's another good question, and I mean, I have to look after myself, but I'm much more focused on our staff, who are much closer to it, and staff who are living in places like Nigeria and Kenya and Myanmar and all the rest of it. We provide lots of support. You have to be super conscious of this as an employer. So we provide lots of psychosocial counsel. We provide lots of counseling for anyone who wants it. And we just talk about it, and we're conscious with it, and we encourage staff to let us know if it's become a real issue. For myself, I try and stay healthy, and I meditate and I exercise and I talk a lot with people. And I'm conscious that, we all suffer when we come into contact with this horrendous abuse. And there's no point pretending you're kind of Superman when you're dealing with this, because all that will happen there is you burn out and break down. Right? You need to be aware of it. And as a CEO, your obligation is to look after yourself so that you can be the best possible CEO for all your staff. So it's something I think is really, really important. Great to leave that as a last lesson on this conversation. Right? CEOs have to look after themselves to look after their staff.
Right. Well, thank you for your service, Nick. Where can people find out more about you and the Freedom Fund?
So we're at freedomfund.org, www.freedomfund.org. All of the information about the organization is there, and I'm on LinkedIn and on Twitter. Nick Grono on Twitter, and Google search for Nick Grono on LinkedIn, and be happy to connect with anyone on either of those platforms.